The warden's hand trembled as he held the phone, listening to the death row inmate's final request. Not a priest. Not family. Not forgiveness. Just 5 minutes with the dog he hadn't seen in 14 years. The prison fell silent because what they didn't know yet was that this simple wish would unravel the most devastating truth anyone had ever heard within those concrete walls. But how could a dog hold the key to a condemned man's soul? Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Andy Dixon sat on the edge of his narrow cot in cell block H, hands folded between his knees, staring at the gray concrete floor. He was 58 now, though the years on death row had carved him into something older, weathered like driftwood, left too long in salt and sun. His hair had gone white. His shoulders curved inward, and his eyes carried the particular emptiness of someone who had stopped fighting time. 14 years he'd been here. 14 years since the jury foreman had stood and spoken those words that became a life sentence in reverse. Guilty. Death. 14 years since they'd walked him down this corridor in shackles, while reporters shouted questions he couldn't answer. The crime was burned into public memory. A convenience store robbery gone catastrophically wrong. 2 people dead, a young mother and the store clerk who tried to be a hero. Andy's fingerprints on the weapon. Andy's face on security footage. Grainy but unmistakable. Andy's car fleeing the scene. The evidence had been overwhelming, suffocating, absolute. He'd maintained his innocence at first, desperately. Then, as the years stretched and appeals failed, he'd gone quiet. Not because he'd accepted guilt, but because he'd accepted that the truth was a luxury the world had decided he didn't deserve. Now, with his execution date set for Friday morning, 72 hours away, Andy had one final request. He wanted to see his dog. Warden James Carver stood in his office, holding the written request like it might contaminate him. He was a practical man, 58, with iron gray hair and a face that had learned to show nothing. He'd overseen 9 executions in his career. Each one had chipped something away from him. But he'd learned to compartmentalize, to see each death row inmate as paperwork rather than a beating heart. This request, though, this stopped him. My name is Andy Dixon, inmate 4721. In 3 days, I will be executed for crimes I have carried the weight of for 14 years. I don't ask for clemency. I don't ask for delay. I ask only for 5 minutes with my dog, Bailey, if she still lives. I don't know if she remembers me. But if there's any mercy left in this world, I'd like to say goodbye to the only soul who never judged me. Carver set the paper down and rubbed his eyes. He'd seen men request final meals, final phone calls, final meetings with estranged children. He'd seen men request nothing at all, walking to their deaths with blank resignation. But a dog. That was new. He picked up the phone and dialed his deputy. Henderson, I need you to track down a dog. Golden retriever, probably ancient by now. Name's Bailey. Last known owner, Andy Dixon. Start with animal control, shelters, vet records. What Carver didn't know yet was that finding Bailey would lead them straight into the truth Andy had carried alone all these years. A truth so crushing that even speaking it aloud would have sounded like a desperate lie. Deputy Warden Abigail Henderson was 37, with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. When Carver handed her the assignment, she read Andy Dixon's file with the thoroughness she brought to everything. The crime scene photos were brutal. Blood pooled on linoleum tiles. A young woman slumped near the refrigerated section. The clerk behind the counter, 22 years old. His life ended over $273. The evidence was damning. Andy's fingerprints on the 9mm Beretta. His face captured at 3 angles, entering the store, pointing the weapon, fleeing. his car recorded by traffic cameras 6 blocks away, and in his apartment, hidden in a heating vent, the money, still banded, still blood-stained. Henderson closed the file. Her job was to find a dog, nothing more. She started with county animal control records from 14 years ago. Andy had lived in a small rental house on the eastern edge of town. After his arrest, the landlord had cleared the property. But there was a notation that made Henderson sit straighter. Dog removed by neighbor, Margaret Garza, 437 Maple Drive. Golden Retriever, female, approximately 7 years old. Owner declined surrender to shelter. Henderson ran a property search. Margaret Garza still lived there. 73 years old now, widowed, no criminal record. The drive took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that wore their decline like badges. But Margaret Garza's house stood different, tidy and bright, with flower boxes under the windows and a vegetable garden in the side yard. Henderson knocked. The door opened to reveal a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a cardigan despite the warmth, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Garza, I'm Deputy Warden Henderson. I'm hoping you can help me with information about a dog." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Bailey." Henderson nodded. "You remember her?" "I remember everything. Come in." The house was immaculate, filled with the scent of lavender and old books. Margaret led Henderson to a small sitting room. "She's in the backyard," Margaret said before Henderson could ask. 21 years old now, practically a miracle. "I've spent a small fortune keeping her comfortable." Henderson leaned forward. "Andy Dixon has requested to see her. His execution is in 3 days. Margaret's hands tightened into fists. That man loved that dog more than anything in this world. When they arrested him, Bailey howled for 3 days straight. The landlord was going to shoot her. I took her in. Why? Why take in the dog of a convicted murderer? Margaret stood, walked to the window. Because I knew Andy Dixon. Not well, but enough. He was my neighbor for 3 years. Quiet man, kept to himself. But every evening at 6 o'clock, he'd walk that dog around the block. Rain, snow, didn't matter. The way he talked to her, gentle, like she understood every word. The way she looked at him, like he was the only thing that mattered. She turned back. I've lived 73 years. I've learned to read people. That man, whatever he did or didn't do, loved that dog purely. So I kept her, waiting, though I didn't know for what. Maybe for this. Henderson felt something shift in her chest. Can I see her? In the backyard, beneath a shaded oak, Bailey lay on a cushioned dog bed. She was ancient, her golden fur turned white, her body thin and frail. But when Henderson approached, the dog lifted her head, and her eyes were still bright. She doesn't have much time left, Margaret said softly. The vet says maybe weeks. I've been keeping her comfortable, but she's tired. Henderson knelt beside Bailey. Mrs. Garza, did Andy Dixon ever talk to you about that night? Margaret's voice went quiet. Once. About 2 weeks before his arrest, he came to my door late, maybe 11 at night. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He asked me if I would watch Bailey for a few days, said he needed to take care of something. I said yes. He never came back. Did he say what? No. But he looked frightened, not guilty. Frightened. There's a difference. Henderson stood. I'll need to arrange transport for Bailey to the prison. Margaret nodded. I'll bring her myself. I've kept her this long. I'll see it through. What neither of them knew was that Bailey carried her own testimony, locked in the only memory that mattered, waiting 14 years to finally be heard. Back at the prison, Henderson compiled her report, but couldn't shake Margaret Garza's certainty. Something about the old woman's conviction that Andy Dixon had been frightened, rather than guilty, lodged in Henderson's mind like a splinter. She pulled Andy's file again, this time looking for gaps instead of conclusions. The investigation had been swift, almost perfunctory. Evidence collected, suspect arrested. Case closed within 72 hours. The prosecutor had called it textbook, but Henderson had been trained to ask questions others forgot. She started with the timeline. The robbery occurred at 10:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Security footage showed Andy entering at 10:45 p.m., alone, wearing a dark hoodie. 2 minutes later, shots fired. By 10:49 p.m., Andy was captured fleeing. By 11:03 p.m., his car was spotted 6 blocks away. By 2:15 a.m., police had surrounded his apartment. He'd surrendered without resistance, claiming he'd been home all evening, alone with his dog. Henderson pulled the witness statements. 3 witnesses described: male, medium build, dark clothing, approximately 6 feet tall. Andy Dixon was 5'10". Close enough, the detectives had decided. She pulled the forensic reports next. Andy's fingerprints on the weapon, clear and unmistakable. His DNA on the hoodie found in his closet. The stolen money hidden in his heating vent, exactly where an anonymous tip had told police to look. Anonymous tip. Henderson circled those words. Who had called it in? The report listed only concerned citizen, a man's voice, brief and specific. He'd known exactly where the money was hidden. She called the evidence room and requested the original Beretta. It arrived in a sealed bag. Henderson pulled latex gloves and examined the weapon. The trigger guard showed wear consistent with left-handed use. Andy Dixon was right-handed. It was in his file, noted in the medical section. A small detail, maybe meaningless, but Henderson had learned that truth often hid in small details. She pulled the interrogation transcripts. Andy's story had been consistent across 14 hours of questioning. He'd been home. He'd walked Bailey at 6 o'clock. He'd made dinner, watched television, gone to bed around 10. He had no alibi beyond his dog. He couldn't explain the fingerprints, the footage, the money. He'd maintained his innocence even as the evidence crushed him. His lawyer had advised him to plead guilty, to accept life without parole instead of risking death. Andy had refused. I didn't do this. I don't know how to prove it, but I didn't do this. Henderson closed the file and sat in the gathering dark. Somewhere in cell block H, Andy Dixon was counting down his final hours. And somewhere in a house on Maple Drive, an ancient dog was waiting. But Henderson's instincts whispered that she was missing something critical. She picked up the phone and called Carver. Sir, I found the dog. Margaret Garza has been caring for her for 14 years. She's willing to bring Bailey to the prison. Good work. Arrange it for tomorrow morning. Sir, there's something else. I've been reviewing the case file. There are inconsistencies. A long pause. Henderson, Andy Dixon has exhausted every appeal. What inconsistencies? The timeline, the weapon wear patterns, the anonymous tip. Nothing conclusive, but enough to make me wonder. Another pause, longer. Wondering doesn't change outcomes. Arrange the dog visit. That's all we can do now. Henderson hung up, but the wondering had already taken root. That night, she drove to the address where the murders had occurred, to the convenience store that had since become a laundromat, and stood in the parking lot where 2 people had lost their lives. The neighborhood was quiet, residential. Andy Dixon had lived 3 miles away. No connection to this neighborhood, no reason to target this store, no history of violence beyond a DUI 7 years prior. Henderson closed her eyes and tried to see it. Someone desperate enough to kill for $273. Someone reckless enough to shoot in a store with cameras. Someone who fled but wasn't caught on any other surveillance between the scene and Andy Dixon's apartment. Unless Andy Dixon hadn't fled at all, unless someone else had, someone who knew exactly how to make certain Andy took the fall. When Henderson returned to her car, her hands were shaking, because if that were true, then they were about to execute the wrong man, and there were only 60 hours left to prove it. But what she didn't know was that the proof had been waiting all along in the form of an aging golden retriever who remembered everything about the night her master disappeared. Friday morning arrived cold and gray. Andy Dixon had not slept. He sat on his cot watching the light change through the small window, his last sunrise. But now that it was here, he felt only strange, quiet calm. At 7 o'clock, Warden Carver appeared. "Dixon, you have a visitor." Andy stood slowly. "Bailey?" Carver nodded. "You've got 15 minutes. We extended it." They walked him through the corridors in handcuffs. Henderson walked beside them, her expression tight and troubled. The meeting room was small, neutral, with concrete walls and fluorescent lighting. In the center sat Margaret Garza, and at her feet, on a thick cushion, lay Bailey. Andy stopped in the doorway. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. 14 years collapsed into nothing. He was 44 again, walking his dog around the block at 6 o'clock, talking to her about his day, about the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Bailey had been his anchor. Now she was dying, just as he was. But she lifted her head, and her tail, which hadn't moved in months according to Margaret, began to wag. Slowly, then faster. "Oh God," Andy whispered. His legs gave out. He fell to his knees, and the sound that came from him was something between a sob and a prayer. Carver removed the handcuffs without being asked. Andy crawled forward until he reached Bailey. The old dog struggled to her feet, whining, pressing her nose against his face, his neck, his hands, breathing him in like she'd been waiting 14 years for this exact moment. Andy buried his face in her fur and wept. Great, shaking sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside him that everyone in the room had to look away. Everyone except Henderson, who watched with laser focus. "I'm sorry," Andy whispered into Bailey's fur. "I'm so sorry I left you." Bailey licked his face, his tears. And then Bailey did something extraordinary. She pulled away from Andy, turned, and walked unsteadily to the corner where Henderson stood. The old dog looked up at the deputy warden, then back at Andy, then back at Henderson. She barked once, a rusty sound that hadn't been used in months. "What's she doing?" Carver asked. Margaret Garza stepped forward, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. "She's trying to tell us something. She always did this when something was wrong, when Andy was in danger. She'd alert, then try to lead someone to help." Andy had gone very still. "Bailey." "Here, girl." But Bailey didn't return. She barked again, then walked to the door, looked back at Henderson, and barked a third time. Henderson's mind was racing. She knelt beside Bailey. "Mrs. Garza, you said Andy came to your door 2 weeks before his arrest. The night he looked frightened." "Yes." "Did Bailey act strangely that night?" Margaret thought for a moment. She was agitated, kept pulling at Andy's sleeve, trying to pull him away, like she wanted him to run. Henderson stood and turned to Andy. "Tell me about that night." Andy looked at her. And for the first time in 14 years, hope flickered in his eyes. Dangerous hope. "Someone came to my apartment," he said quietly. "Late, maybe 10:30. I thought it was my neighbor. I opened the door. 2 men pushed inside. I'd never seen them before. They wore masks. One put a gun to my head and told me to sit down and shut up." Carver leaned forward. "Dixon, you never mentioned this at trial." "I did. In my first interrogation. The detective said I was making it up, that there was no evidence of forced entry. They said I was trying to create an alibi. My lawyer advised me to stop talking about it because it made me look like a liar." Henderson felt her heart hammering. What did they want? They didn't say. They didn't take anything. They just held me there for maybe an hour. One kept watching the door like he was waiting for something. Then his phone rang. He answered, listened, nodded. They left. That's it. Bailey went crazy afterward, wouldn't calm down. I was terrified they'd come back. That's when I went to Mrs. Garza's house, asked her to take Bailey while I figured out what to do. And 2 weeks later, you were arrested. Andy nodded. 2 weeks later, I was arrested for murders I didn't commit, with evidence I couldn't explain. Nobody believed me. Henderson turned to Carver. Sir, I need to make a phone call. Right now. But before Carver could respond, Bailey collapsed. The old dog simply folded, her breathing suddenly labored. Margaret rushed to her side. Andy crawled back, gathered Bailey into his arms. No, he whispered. Not yet. Please, not yet. Bailey's eyes found his. Her tail wagged once. Twice, then went still. She exhaled slowly, and the light in her eyes transformed from presence to memory, from here to beyond. Andy held her, rocking slightly, his tears falling silently onto her white fur. In that moment, everyone understood that Bailey had stayed alive for this, had fought through age and pain for this final meeting, this final chance to tell a truth only she knew. She had witnessed her master's fear. She had tried to warn, to protect. And now, having delivered her testimony in the only way she could, she let go. Henderson made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. First to the district attorney's office. Second, to the chief of police. Third, to the governor's legal counsel. She spoke quickly, precisely, laying out the inconsistencies she'd found, the witness that had just emerged. I'm requesting a stay of execution. Immediately. We need 48 hours to investigate. The response was skepticism, resistance. But Henderson was relentless. A man's life hangs on this. If there's even a possibility we've got the wrong person, we owe it to every principle this system claims to uphold to look again. At 8:47 a.m., 93 minutes before Andy Dixon's scheduled execution, the governor's office issued a stay. 48 hours. In the meeting room, Andy still held Bailey's body. Carver had moved to his side, one hand on Andy's shoulder. Dixon, Carver said softly, they've issued a stay. 2 days. The deputy warden has raised enough questions to warrant a reinvestigation. Andy didn't move. She waited, he whispered. 14 years. She waited to tell them. Henderson knelt beside them. Andy, I need you to tell me everything. Every detail about those men. And so, with Bailey's body cooling in his arms, Andy Dixon began to talk. He talked about the men's builds, their voices, the way one had a distinctive scar on his left hand. He talked about the phone call, the words he'd overheard. It's done. He's in place. 2 weeks. Henderson recorded every word, because suddenly the pieces were shifting, reforming into a different picture. Not a random robbery. A setup. A frame. A carefully constructed scenario designed to destroy an innocent man's life. The question was why? Why Andy Dixon? The answer came from Margaret Garza. Andy, she said, did you ever wonder about your neighbor? The one in apartment 4B. Andy looked up, confused. Derek? What about him? Derek Sutton. He moved out 2 days after your arrest. I remember because it seemed sudden. He'd lived there for 3 years, then just vanished. Henderson felt electricity run down her spine. What did Derek Sutton look like? Tall, maybe 6 feet, medium build, dark hair. The same description as the fleeing suspect. Henderson was already pulling her phone, running database searches. Derek Sutton. No criminal record. No forwarding address. But when she cross-referenced with social media from 14 years ago, she found a photo. Derek Sutton standing next to another man at a bar, both grinning, and on the second man's left hand, visible in the photograph, a distinctive scar. "Andy," Henderson said, her voice tight. "Did Derek Sutton have access to your apartment?" "He had a spare key. I gave it to him when I first moved in case I ever locked myself out." "And your car keys?" "They were on the same ring." The frame crystallized. Derek Sutton and his accomplice had chosen their mark carefully. Someone isolated, someone who lived alone with just a dog. They'd taken his key, copied it, returned it. They'd planted evidence over time, fingerprints lifted and transferred, DNA collected and staged. And when the night came, they'd held Andy in his apartment while the real robbery occurred, creating a timeline that placed him both at the scene and away from it. Henderson made another call, this time to the FBI, because if she was right, Derek Sutton had likely done this before. And within hours, agents were pulling cold cases, unsolved murders, robberies where the evidence had seemed too perfect. What they found made national news. Derek Sutton, whose real name was Derek Chambers, was wanted in connection with 4 similar cases across 3 states. Professional criminals who specialized in framing innocent people for crimes they committed, letting patsies take the fall. Andy Dixon had been their most successful frame, until an elderly dog refused to let the truth die with her. The 48-hour stay extended into 2 weeks as investigators worked frantically to untangle 14 years of injustice. Derek Chambers was located in Arizona, living under an assumed name. When FBI agents raided his home, they found a storage locker filled with trophies from his crimes. Newspaper clippings, court transcripts, photographs of the people he'd framed. Andy Dixon's face stared out from a laminated article, the word "guilty" circled in red marker. Chambers's partner, Thomas Riggs, was found dead in Nevada, killed in a drug deal 8 years earlier. But Chambers, facing life without parole, cooperated fully. He described the Dixon job with chilling detail, how they'd selected Andy for his isolation and predictable routines, how they'd spent 2 months preparing, collecting evidence, building the frame, how they'd held him in his apartment while Riggs executed the robbery, then planted the money and weapon using the keys they'd copied. "Why Dixon specifically?" Chambers shrugged. "Wrong place, wrong time. He fit the profile. Nobody would miss him." Except someone had. A golden retriever had missed him every day for 14 years. And an elderly neighbor had kept that dog alive against all odds, waiting for a moment she didn't even know would come. On a gray Tuesday morning in late October, Andy Dixon walked out of the correctional facility a free man. The governor had issued a full pardon, and the state had begun processing what would become one of the largest wrongful conviction settlements in history. But Andy, standing in the autumn sunlight for the first time in 14 years, didn't think about money or vindication. He thought about Bailey. Warden James Carver met him at the gate. They stood facing each other, 2 men on opposite sides of justice, now united by the knowledge of how fragile truth could be. "I'm sorry," Carver said. The words were inadequate, but they were all he had. Andy nodded slowly. "You saw it when it mattered. You let me have those 15 minutes. That's enough." Deputy Warden Abigail Henderson approached, carrying a small wooden box. "Margaret Garza asked me to give you this, Bailey's ashes. She thought you should have them." Andy took the box, held it against his chest. His throat worked, but no words came. Henderson wasn't finished. "The victims' families have been informed. They want to meet you when you're ready. They want to apologize." "They have nothing to apologize for," Andy said. "They lost people they loved. They needed someone to blame. I just happened to be in the way." Over the following months, Andy Dixon became an unlikely advocate for criminal justice reform. He spoke at law schools, at police academies, at judicial conferences. He told his story without bitterness, focusing instead on the systemic failures that had nearly cost him his life. The rushed investigation, the tunnel vision, the ignored details. But mostly, he talked about Bailey, about the loyalty of a dog who never forgot, about the neighbor who kept faith when the system didn't, about the deputy warden who asked the right questions when everyone else had stopped asking at all. Margaret Garza attended every one of his speeches, sitting in the front row. Afterward, they would have coffee, and Andy would tell her stories about Bailey when she was young, about the walks around the block, about the way she'd sleep at the foot of his bed, always alert, always protecting. "She saved my life twice," Andy said during one of these conversations. "Once by being there when I had nobody else, and once by refusing to let me die for someone else's crime." Margaret smiled. "She loved you. Simple as that. Dogs don't know how to love halfway." On the first anniversary of his release, Andy returned to the correctional facility, not as an inmate, but as a visitor. He met with Abigail Henderson, who had since been promoted to warden of a different prison, bringing her reform-minded approach to a system desperate for change. They sat in her office, drinking coffee, talking about the cases she'd reopened since Andy's exoneration. 6 more wrongful convictions uncovered. 6 more lives returned. "Bailey started something," Henderson said. "That moment when she tried to communicate, when she forced us to see beyond the evidence to the truth behind it. That changed how I look at every case now. I ask myself, what am I missing? What small detail holds the key?" Andy set down his cup. "I've been thinking about getting another dog. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I think Bailey would want me to." Henderson smiled. "I think Bailey would demand it." He did get another dog, a rescue golden retriever puppy he named Hope. And every evening at 6 o'clock, Andy walked her around the block, talking to her about his day, about the letters he received from other wrongfully convicted people, about the slow, difficult work of rebuilding a life after years in the shadow of death. Sometimes during these walks, he felt Bailey's presence beside them, not haunting, guiding, reminding him that love transcends time and injustice, and even death itself. That loyalty is not measured in years, but in the courage to keep believing when the world has stopped. The convenience store where 2 people died had long since become a community center. On the wall inside, a plaque memorialized the young mother and the college student whose lives had ended there. And beside it, added years later, another plaque, smaller, simpler. "In memory of Bailey, Golden Retriever, 2003-2017, who taught us that truth waits patiently and love never forgets. Sometimes justice needs 4 legs and a pure heart to remind us what we're supposed to be fighting for." Andy visited that plaque often, running his fingers over the engraved letters, feeling the weight of what Bailey's life had meant. She'd been 7 years old when he left, expected to live maybe 10 or 12 years. She'd made it to 21, defying biology, staying alive through sheer will and the promise of one final moment with the person she loved most. That moment had saved him. And in saving him, it had revealed the truth to a justice system that had stopped looking for it. On a cold December evening, as snow began to fall softly over the city, Andy Dixon sat in his small apartment, with Hope curled at his feet. He opened the wooden box that held Bailey's ashes and spoke to her the way he always had, with gentle honesty. "You did it, girl. You brought me home. You brought me home." And somewhere in the silence that followed, between the falling snow and the golden puppy's soft breathing and the weight of years finally lightened, Andy could have sworn he heard a familiar sound, the gentle thump of a tail against the floor, a quiet, certain answer. Finally home. If this story touched something in you, hit that like button and share it with someone you want to hear with. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story.